Chapter 19. Mazen. The first time Mazen had ventured into the desert, he'd been learning how to ride a horse. Though there were fields in the noble quarter that had been cleared for such practices, the Sultan insisted the best place for him to learn was in the terrain where he would be doing most of his riding. Mazen could still remember his wonder then, when he'd stepped beyond the city gate for the first time and witnessed the majesty of the desert up close. He remembered the air shimmering with particles of dust so fine they looked like twinkling stars. He remembered the landscape, a tide of sand that shone gold beneath the setting sun, and the wind, which tugged playfully at his clothing. The lessons had been difficult, but Mazen had nonetheless enjoyed them. Back then, things had been simpler. He'd been just a child looking forward to the important business trips he would one day accompany his father on. He had imagined ventures where he would brag to his mother about. And then his mother had died, and those days never came. A strange nostalgia swept over him now that he followed the traveler's path out of Medine's front gate. He was struck with the peculiar feeling that he was riding into the past rather than the future. There was that same sunset painting the distant dunes a golden red, and there was dust that glittered faintly in the air, carried on a gentle breeze. He looked down, noticing yellow wildflowers shooting out from the sand, and wondered if someone had planted them there, or if even this small offshoot of greenery had sprung from gin blood. He would have asked the question aloud if he had been himself. He shifted hopefully, discreetly, in his saddle. It had been a long while since he had been on a horse. He was still remembering how to relax his body. No, how to relax Omar's body, which was heavier, sturdier than his. Thankfully, none of his traveling companions paid his restless movements any mind. In fact, none of them spoke at all. Mazen tried to be optimistic about the silence. At the very least, it gave him time to appreciate the journey, the remarkably short journey. When the rock-lined path quickly disappeared, the merchant took out a compass and used it to guide them in the right direction. From there, they had only to follow the tracks of other travelers for a couple of hours until they came to the first stop on their map, an outpost not far from the city, a spot visitors called Al-Waha al-Khadra, the Green Oasis. It was more a retreat than a stopover, a miniature town made up of clay buildings and colorful stalls. At the heart of the outpost was the oasis, a large body of water surrounded by yellow grasses, sloping date trees, and tents. Mazen could not help but wonder how many jinn had died to create it. The morose thought hung over him like a dark cloud as they entered the outpost, and Luli al-Nazari turned to address them. "We camp here tonight," she said stiffly, and then she rode on ahead without waiting for a response. Mazen watched her stifle a yawn as she and her bodyguard headed for the space by the water reserved for overnight camping. He wondered briefly at her exhaustion before turning his attention to the new and unfamiliar sights around him. He took in the women walking with woven baskets on their heads, the men leaning against trees, munching on skewers of lamb, and the children darting behind stalls, giggling as they hid from each other. The scene brought the briefest of smiles to his face before he realized he was meant to be Omar, and Omar would not gawk at such things. He pushed his horse forward, beating dust from his clothing as he followed after Aisha bint Luas, who had paused the short distance away. She had not said anything on the journey. In fact, she had not spoken to him at all, except to tell him to stand taller at the procession. The silence between them persisted as they stepped up to their tent. Luli al-Nazari did not speak to them again for the rest of the night, though Mazen spotted her wandering the outpost stalls. She spent every waking moment with her bodyguard, who loomed behind her like a shadow. Every time Mazen thought about approaching her, the bodyguard, Mazen had overheard her call him Kadir, would frown at him from a distance. Mazen found his deadpan stare even more disconcerting than Aisha's permanent scowl. By the time midnight rolled around, Mazen had barely spoken to any of the travelers around the outpost, save for a few who recognized his face beneath his hood. It was a strange thing to be recognized as his brother, an even stranger thing when people smiled at him with stars in their eyes and referred to him by titles that did not belong to him. King of the 40 Thieves, they called him, Hero, but strangest was the third title, which he'd never heard before, the Stardust Thief. It was worse than the other titles because it was proof that everyone knew what Omar truly was, a man who stole Jinn lives, a killer dressed in silver blood. He was still thinking about the title when he fell asleep in his tent that night. It passed into his nightmares, a whisper on his lips when Omar approached with the black knife. "Spare me, Stardust Thief, spare me." But Omar, terrible smirking Omar, had no mercy. He brought the knife down, and Mazen awoke with his heart in his throat. At first he couldn't breathe, could only sit there in shock as he took in the unfamiliar cloth walls surrounding him. He was in a tent, he realized, not his bedroom, not the palace. He ran his hands shakily through his hair, only to realize his curls were gone, replaced with coarse, cropped strands. "Something wrong, Prince?" Mazen looked up and saw Aisha stretched out on the bedroll across from him. She had propped herself up on an elbow and was frowning at him. Gods, the fall of a feather could wake her. "It's nothing," he mumbled, "just a nightmare." Aisha raised a brow. "Need me to sing a lullaby?" Mazen blinked. This was the first time she had responded to something he'd said. Exhausted, he shook his head and stood. Aisha continued to watch him. She was very pretty, Mazen thought, even if she was more than a little terrifying. She had alluring eyes that were brown, so dark they were nearly black. Her hair, which had been braided earlier, now fell in a silky curtain around her shoulders. Her face was all angles, sharp cheekbones and nose, slanted eyebrows, and a pointed chin. If the legends were true, and humans had been made from the earth, then Aisha bint Luas had been sculpted from the toughest, harshest stone. "I'm going to get some fresh air." He was on his way out when the thief said, "The nightmares are normal. I had them too when I first fought Jinn. They'll go away." She eased herself back down into her bedroll and turned away from him with a sigh. "Eventually." Mazen's heart lifted at the reassurance, brusque as it was. "I'm relieved to hear it." Aisha didn't respond, but he was unoffended. Now that the silence between them had broken, it no longer seemed so heavy. A smile touched his lips as he pushed open the tent flap. "Tesbahin ala khair," he murmured. "Wa inta min Allah," came the grumbled response as he exited. Earlier, the area outside had been lively, filled with visitors sharing food and gossip. Now it was quiet. The campfires had been put out, and the only light came from the distant torches surrounding the perimeter of the encampment. At first, the darkness was suffocating. He hissed and whispered, drawing Mazen back into his nightmares. But then he saw the sky. There was no smoke, no trees, no buildings, just that infinite expanse of midnight blue punctuated by scintillating stars. He thought of Hakim, who years ago had taught him to see constellations. As a boy, Hakim had learned to navigate by them. Mazen had thought he'd be able to do the same once he left the city. But if the stars were a compass, they were one he did not know yet how to read. The wind gently pulled at his clothing as he wandered to the oasis at the campsite's center. As he circled the water, he observed that the breeze did not permeate Omar's skin the way it did his. In Omar's body, he felt warmer, lighter, and though he was still learning the equilibrium of his brother's body, he realized he nonetheless felt more confident in his skin, more capable. The best part of their switch, however, was that the injury from the shadow Jinn had ceased to exist, which made it possible for him to forget he'd fallen prey to her, until the nightmares returned. Dread coiled in his chest. When next he was able to coax Aisha into speaking with him, he would have to ask her how long it had taken for her nightmares to subside. He sighed as he returned to the clearing where their tent was. A campfire he was sure had not been there before crackled at the center. He stared at it. Surely someone would have thought to put it out by now. "Lost, Prince?" Mazen jumped at the sound of the voice. By the fire, where he was sure there had been nothing before, he suddenly saw a shadow of a man, a dark-skinned phantom with burning embers for eyes. Mazen nearly fainted at the sight of him. Not a Jinn. He took a deep breath to calm his heart. Not a Jinn. He stepped forward and the vision dissipated. Shadows gave way to light, and Mazen saw a familiar man sitting by the firelight. Kadir, the midnight merchant's bodyguard. Mazen swallowed his nerves and chuckled. "Me? Lost? What an amusing thought." The bodyguard looked away, turning his attention to something balanced on his knee. A compass. Even in the dark, Mazen could see the arrow swaying back and forth. He wondered if the compass the merchant had referred to during their ride. It certainly looked the same, though it didn't look particularly dependable now. Mazen raised a brow. A broken compass? Kadir didn't even spare him a glance. Not broken, just precise. Precise? The bodyguard offered no response. Mazen waited for a while, but he could not fashion the quiet into a weapon like his brother could. In the end, he walked away. He was curious, but he was also tired. He hoped that this time he would be able to sleep